What is the true price of silence? The silence that hides truths, that conceals terrible events and ultimately destroys those it touches. Today, we're diving into a story that goes far beyond sacred texts, a story about how even a man known as a man after God's own heart could fail terribly as a father. Picture a young, innocent girl, her heart light and her smile bright, happily making her way through the grand halls of the palace. She is carefree, filled with hope, and unaware of the darkness that awaits her. As she heads towards her brother's room, her mind is full of nothing but warmth and trust. But this moment, meant to be simple and innocent, will soon turn into a nightmare, with the most heartbreaking part being the silence of the one who should have shielded her. Before we continue, I want to ask you to leave a like on the video to support us. And if you enjoy this kind of content, subscribe to the channel and also click the notification bell. God bless you. To grasp the depth of this family tragedy, we must journey back to Jerusalem, centuries before the birth of Christ. At the city's highest point stood the grand royal palace, the residence of David, the greatest king Israel had ever known. He was a man who conquered kingdoms, defeated giants, and composed psalms that still touch hearts today. But this is not a story of his triumphs. This is about his greatest failure as a father. David's empire was impressive. His military victories expanded Israel's reach. His kingdom flourished, and his name became synonymous with wisdom and justice. Yet, within the palace walls, a complex and troubled family dynamic was brewing, one that would ultimately expose his greatest failings. Tamar was the daughter of King David, a young and innocent princess who was known for her beauty and virtue. She was the full sister of Absalom and half-sister to Amnon, all of them living within the grand palace of Jerusalem. David had many wives, and his children were born to different mothers, which led to a complicated family structure. These divisions often created distance and rivalry among the siblings, as each mother had her own ambitions for her children, hoping they would rise in favor and prominence. For Tamar, the palace was her home, a place where she should have felt safe and protected. She grew up surrounded by luxury, believing her family would always be her refuge. However, beneath the surface of this royal life, jealousy, rivalry, and ambition festered among David's children. These hidden tensions created a dangerous environment, turning the palace from a place of supposed safety into one filled with silent threats. These hidden tensions created a dangerous environment, turning the palace from a place of supposed safety into a place where silent threats lurked. Tamar's story reveals the heartbreaking impact that can unfold when family issues are neglected and left to fester. What follows will reveal just how deeply the effects of silence can fracture a family, with consequences that extend far beyond what anyone could have imagined. To many, this story might feel like an ancient biblical narrative, yet it resonates with timeless truths about the costs of staying silent when action is needed. David's life was marked by incredible public triumphs, defeating Goliath, uniting the tribes of Israel, and expanding his kingdom's influence. Despite these great victories, his private life was filled with profound defeats that stemmed from his inability to confront difficult family dynamics. How often do we see something wrong and choose to turn a blind eye, perhaps to maintain a fragile peace, or because we think it's not our place to step in? These moments of neglect allowed suffering to grow unchecked in David's family, leaving scars that no public achievement could erase. As we delve deeper, a pressing question arises. What's the true cost of staying silent when you should speak up? This is just the beginning of a journey into the heart of David's story, where his silence sets off a chain of events that will leave a lasting mark on his family for generations. David's family structure was, at the very least, complex, with many layers contributing to its challenges. David, celebrated for his victories and the unification of Israel, also built a vast household composed of multiple wives, concubines, and many children. Concubines were women who had a recognized status in the household, often serving as secondary partners to the king. While they were not considered wives, they lived with the king and bore his children, which added to the number of heirs and complicated family dynamics. On the surface, this family appeared strong and prosperous, reflecting David's achievements as a ruler. However, beneath this facade, tensions simmered. Each of David's wives had their own children, leading to divided loyalties and competing interests. Mothers often sought to secure favor and future power for their own offspring, which naturally led to rivalry and jealousy among the siblings. This complex blend of multiple wives and children from different mothers created a fragile web of ambitions, mistrust, and alliances. Figures like Amnon, Absalom, and Tamar were caught in these dynamics, each navigating their own place within this complicated royal lineage, setting the stage for future conflict. As the firstborn, Amnon held a position of special privilege. He was the son of Ahinoam of Jezreel, one of David's wives, and as the eldest, he naturally assumed that the throne would one day be his. This belief shaped his actions, instilling in him a sense of entitlement and confidence that often led him to cross boundaries without fear of consequences. Absalom, on the other hand, was the son of Maacah, daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur. He had a different kind of presence. Known for his striking physical appearance, described as flawless from head to toe, and his natural charisma, Absalom was admired by many. His charm made him popular, and he easily gained influence among the people. However, beneath this charm lay a fierce ambition and determination that would eventually drive his actions. Tamar, their sister, was the innocent and kind-hearted princess, admired for her beauty and virtue. Unlike her brothers, Tamar had no ambitions of power. Her only desire was to live peacefully within the palace. Yet her innocence and goodness made her vulnerable to the dangerous ambitions brewing among her family members, ultimately drawing her into the tragic conflicts that lay beneath the surface of palace life. In those days, a king's children were more than just family. They were symbols of potential power and influence within the kingdom. Each mother, whether a wife or concubine, had her own ambitions for her children, hoping to secure a prominent position for them within David's vast kingdom. This competition led to subtle alliances and fierce rivalries, which fed insecurities and distrust among the siblings. The scriptures provide glimpses into this complex and fragile family environment, highlighting the intense pressure that came with royal life. David's children were not just heirs, but also pawns in a larger struggle for influence. For David, managing the affairs of Israel with its battles and politics came naturally. However, managing the personal desires, ambitions, and hidden dangers within his own household proved to be a far more challenging and ultimately devastating task. And what of David's role as a father? For all his prowess in battle and skill in leading Israel, David often seemed distant, even oblivious, to the struggles within his own family. The scriptures tell us about his remarkable ability to judge and mediate for his people, yet the same insight seemed to escape him when it came to his own children. It's striking to think that a man so capable of uniting tribes and managing conflicts across the kingdom failed to see the jealousy, rivalry, and discord festering right under his own roof. Was David too absorbed in his responsibilities as a ruler to notice the silent turmoil growing among his children? Or perhaps he believed that, in time, these issues would simply fade away. But such problems, left unaddressed, only grew worse, simmering quietly until they erupted into open conflict. The question remains, how much longer could this silence hold before everything began to unravel? The royal palace, filled with David's children, wasn't simply a place of laughter and family gatherings. It was a place where rivalry and covetousness crept in quietly, like shadows stretching across the palace halls. David had many children, at least 19 sons and one daughter, Tamar, born to different mothers, which only added to the complexity of family dynamics. Amnon, as David's firstborn, was the son of Ahinoam of Jezreel, and he grew up believing that power was his birthright. He relished his status as the eldest, assuming he would inherit his father's throne. With a father like David, a king who united Israel and commanded respect, Amnon naturally expected his life to follow a path of privilege and influence. But this sense of entitlement and privilege soon twisted into something far darker, laying the seeds for his own undoing. The palace, meant to be a place of safety, slowly became the breeding ground for envy and unchecked ambitions. And this quiet, creeping tension was just the beginning of something much more devastating that would shake David's family to its core. Absalom, on the other hand, was known for his striking physical beauty and magnetic charm. He was described in the scriptures as flawless from head to toe, and his presence alone could captivate people with ease. Absalom became a natural leader, someone others instinctively followed, even without him saying a word. While Amnon enjoyed the privileges of being the firstborn, Absalom thrived on his charisma and the favor he received from those around him. The rivalry between them ran deeper than mere sibling tension. It was a clash of ambition and influence. This underlying competition simmered quietly, especially as Tamar, their sister, moved with a grace and innocence that set her apart in a palace filled with hidden motives and personal agendas. Tamar's gentle presence seemed like the one source of tranquility in a turbulent environment. But it was precisely this innocence and purity that would make her vulnerable to the dangers lurking within the palace walls. The unspoken tensions were building, and soon the fragile peace within David's family would be shattered in a way that no one could have anticipated. The scriptures illustrate how envy can take root even in the most sacred of spaces. Despite the wealth, prestige, and blessings within the royal palace, it wasn't enough for each of David's sons to simply hold their own. Amnon and Absalom's ambitions became entangled, not just out of personal desire, but driven by the silent, underlying need for their father's approval and greater influence. David, who could have provided much-needed guidance or issued words of caution, often remained detached, allowing the situation to fester. This silence, instead of preventing conflict, only made room for rivalry to grow unchecked. In his absence as a guiding force, the competition between his sons intensified, and their desires deepened in darker ways that would eventually spiral out of control. The tension built like a brewing storm, one whose full force no one dared to acknowledge but everyone would soon have to face. This rivalry wasn't just a sibling squabble, it was a dangerous blend of desire, ego, and a thirst for power. In that palace, everyone had something to gain and everything to lose, especially when each step taken could upset the fragile balance between family members. The palace should have been a sanctuary for Tamar, a place of protection. But here, surrounded by ambitions and divided loyalties, her innocence became a target. As much as the royal family aimed for unity, their ambitions tore them apart, turning what could have been bonds of kinship into unseen threats. In every royal court, there are individuals who operate behind the scenes, quietly influencing major events without drawing attention to themselves. Jonadab, a cousin of David's children, was one such figure, a man well known for his cunning nature and keen understanding of palace dynamics. He was a master manipulator, someone who knew how to read people and exploit their weaknesses. The scriptures describe Jonadab as a very shrewd man, 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 3, indicating his ability to navigate palace life with a calculating mind. As Amnon's close confidant, Jonadab wielded both knowledge and influence, positioning himself as a trusted advisor. However, instead of guiding Amnon towards wisdom or helping him make better choices, Jonadab's counsel pushed Amnon down a dark and dangerous path. He fueled Amnon's troubling desires, turning what might have been a fleeting temptation into a dangerous obsession. Jonadab saw an opportunity to manipulate the situation for his own purposes, orchestrating a scheme that would lead to something terrible. He did all of this while staying in the shadows, taking full advantage of Amnon's vulnerabilities and ensuring that he himself remained above suspicion. Jonadab's influence over Amnon was profound, and it's chilling to consider how a single suggestion can twist someone's intentions. Rather than caution Amnon against his disturbing desires, Jonadab crafted a plan that exploited both Amnon's obsession and the palace customs. Jonadab instructed Amnon to pretend to be ill and request a visit from a trusted family member, knowing that in the culture of the palace, caring for an ailing sibling would be viewed as an act of compassion. Jonadab understood the customs well. He knew that such a request would not arouse suspicion. The plan appeared innocent, a simple family matter, but beneath the surface, it was a calculated manipulation. This seemingly straightforward approach was intended to lower any defenses, ensuring that what followed would take place without interruption. The plan was deceptively simple, yet it held devastating consequences, setting the stage for a tragic betrayal that would shake the family to its core. In that palace, where family and loyalty should have meant safety, Jonadab's manipulation would pave the way for tragedy. The danger of Jonadab's advice lies in the way it used familial trust as a weapon. David, deeply involved in his responsibilities as king, would naturally not question the intentions behind a request for one family member to care for another. This request appeared entirely reasonable within the palace's customs, where such acts were seen as an expression of familial love and responsibility. Jonadab knew this well. He took advantage of these customs, understanding that no one would suspect his motives. By instructing Amnon to feign illness and request a family member's visit, Jonadab laid a subtle but effective trap. His manipulation went unnoticed by everyone, and he orchestrated events in a way that ensured a trusted family member would be placed in a vulnerable position. This is a stark reminder of how those closest to us can sometimes turn trust into a tool for harm, leaving scars that even power and privilege cannot erase. The scriptures, specifically in 2 Samuel chapter 13 verse 3, state, "But Amnon had a friend named Jonadab, son of Shimeah, David's brother. Jonadab was a very shrewd man." This highlights the dangers of choosing one's counsel poorly. David might have managed Israel's affairs effectively, but his absence within his family allowed Jonadab's influence to flourish unchecked. Jonadab, described as a very shrewd man, used his cunning to exploit vulnerabilities within David's household. Had David been more vigilant, he might have noticed the growing web of manipulation around his children. Jonadab's schemes are a clear example of how family dynamics can be poisoned from within, setting events in motion that would later erupt into open conflict. When trusted individuals exploit those close to them, the consequences can ripple far beyond the immediate circle, affecting the entire family and even the kingdom. With Jonadab's guidance, Amnon's dark intentions became inevitable. The betrayal that followed was just the start of something far more sinister. The manipulation at play would soon lead to heartbreak and unimaginable revenge, sending shockwaves through the palace. The once seemingly stable walls of David's home would be rocked by an unfolding tragedy, one that would bring pain and chaos, touching every family member in ways they could never have predicted. Tamar, a symbol of innocence and purity, stepped into her brother's quarters without any inkling of the darkness lying in wait. She entered not merely as a sister, but also as a compassionate caretaker, embodying the familial duty that was so often expected within royal households. In her eyes, her brother was in need, someone vulnerable who required her care and support. However, what Tamar walked into was an intricate and cruel trap, orchestrated by her brother and fueled by Jonadab's sinister counsel. The trust Tamar had in her family, a trust that should have been sacred, was exploited and shattered, leading to a tragic betrayal that left scars no comfort or luxury of the palace could ever heal. The innocence that filled those palace halls would soon be drowned by something far more ominous. As Tamar realized Amnon's intentions, her response reflected her strength and knowledge of the moral laws of Israel. The scriptures, specifically in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verses 12 and 13, reveal her desperate plea. "No, my brother, do not force me, for no such thing should be done in Israel. Do not do this disgraceful thing, and where could I take my shame? And as for you, you would be like one of the fools in Israel." She reminded Amnon of their family's honor and the consequences of such an act. Tamar's voice was a brave attempt to appeal to his conscience, to find any remnant of decency within him. But her words fell on deaf ears. Amnon, consumed by his desires, overpowered her, ignoring not only her pleas, but also the sacred bond of family that should have restrained him. Tamar's world shifted that day, from one of safety to one marked by a wound that no family bond could ever heal. Following the act, as revealed in the scriptures, specifically in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 15, Amnon's twisted obsession transformed into intense hatred. The verse states, "Then Amnon hated her exceedingly, so that the hatred with which he hated her was greater than the love with which he had loved her." What once was a burning desire became pure contempt, and he cruelly cast Tamar out of his quarters, adding public humiliation to her deep suffering. In her grief, Tamar tore her garments, a symbol of her broken spirit and lost dignity. The torn robe, which was a richly adorned garment marking her status as a royal virgin, represented her innocence that had been violently taken from her. She then covered herself with ashes, an ancient expression of deep mourning and despair, a public display of her profound loss and trauma. These actions were not only a reflection of her personal anguish, but also a cry for the injustice done to her. This tragedy shattered Tamar's spirit and exposed the deep fractures within David's family. She was now marked, her once bright future altered permanently by the vile actions of her own brother, a brother she had trusted. Yet, even in her darkest moment, her pain remained unaddressed by those who should have stood up to protect her, leaving her isolated in her suffering. David's response to Tamar's suffering was one of intense anger, as revealed in the scriptures, specifically in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 21. When King David heard all this, he was furious. Despite his fury, however, he tragically failed to act. Though deeply enraged, David remained silent, offering Tamar neither justice nor solace. For Tamar, this silence was as devastating as the initial betrayal, compounding her suffering and leaving her without hope of vindication. David's lack of response not only deepened Tamar's despair, but also sowed seeds of rage in Absalom, her other brother, who watched helplessly as justice was denied. The silence in David's household echoed louder than any words, signaling that power and privilege seemed to matter more than justice. Tamar's tragedy thus became a painful testament to the dangers of failing to confront wrongdoing, setting the stage for further heartbreak. This dark event laid the groundwork for further heartbreak. Tamar's suffering was only the beginning, and the consequences of David's silence would ripple through his family, leading to a thirst for revenge that would ignite a destructive cycle. In Absalom, Tamar's pain and David's silence would spark a fury that no silence could contain. David's silence after Tamar's tragedy was overwhelming, creating an echo of neglect that reverberated through his household. The scriptures, in 2 Samuel chapter 13, verse 21, reveal that David was furious when he heard of what happened. When King David heard of all these things, he was very angry. Yet despite his rage and sorrow, he did not take any steps to bring justice. For Tamar, this lack of intervention felt like a second betrayal, a devastating realization that justice would not come from the one person who had the power to deliver it. David's failure to act sent a chilling message, not only to Tamar, but to the entire family, that even the king, despite being a man after God's own heart, could sometimes be rendered powerless by his internal conflicts. His silence became a heavy shadow, one that would haunt his household for years to come. The impact of David's silence reached far beyond Tamar. Absalom, her protective brother, was watching everything closely, and a deep anger simmered within him. Seeing his sister broken, her spirit shattered, and his father unwilling to take any action, ignited a slow-burning fury in Absalom that would eventually push him to take matters into his own hands. David's failure to act left a void, a painful emptiness where justice should have been, a void that Absalom would later fill with carefully plotted plans for vengeance. David's neglect wasn't merely a passive choice, it was a silent allowance for the wounds of his family to deepen, for unaddressed pain and grievances to fester and grow. This negligence acted as an invitation for those dormant sorrows to evolve into something far darker, setting the stage for further tragedy. Unchecked grievances within David's household led to disastrous consequences that reverberated through his entire family. David's failure to confront Amnon's wrongdoing allowed injustice to flourish, transforming what should have been a safe and nurturing home into a place of deep resentment and mistrust. Tamar, who had been profoundly wronged, found herself in silence, left to mourn the innocence that had been cruelly taken from her. Meanwhile, Absalom, her brother, watched all of this unfold, distancing himself from his father as his fury grew, hidden but unyielding. David's neglect wasn't merely a lack of action, it actively contributed to creating a toxic environment where emotional wounds were left to fester, and trust within the family was shattered. The scriptures emphasize the vital importance of true leadership that requires courage, integrity, and proactive intervention, especially when the well-being of one's family is at stake. For Absalom, his father's silence was a catalyst, a clear message that justice would not be served within their family. Feeling abandoned by the very man who should have stood up for Tamar, Absalom made a vow to be the voice of his sister's suffering. David's neglect of the situation planted seeds of rebellion deep within Absalom's heart, seeds that would grow into an intense resentment, not just towards Amnon, but also against David himself. By failing to confront Amnon and address Tamar's trauma, David unintentionally set the stage for greater turmoil within his family. Absalom's growing hatred was fueled by the injustice he witnessed, and it would not remain dormant. Instead, it would become the spark for an even larger conflict that would threaten to tear the family apart. This silence from David is a stark reminder of the weight a single action, or lack thereof, can have within a family. The repercussions were only beginning, and soon David's silence would lead Absalom down a path of revenge, forever altering the course of their lives. Absalom's fury over what happened to Tamar simmered quietly, but it was relentless. For 2 long years, he harbored his anger, letting it grow as he witnessed his father's silence and Amnon's impunity. Each day that passed without justice deepened his resolve. Absalom wasn't one to forget. He carried the weight of his sister's suffering with him, his loyalty and love for Tamar demanding retribution. During those 2 years, David's neglect of the situation left a void where justice should have been, a void that Absalom intended to fill. He saw clearly that silence had only allowed the suffering to continue, and his determination to avenge Tamar grew with each moment, as he silently and meticulously planned Amnon's downfall. The passing years were not a time of forgetting, but rather a time of preparation for Absalom, who knew that justice delayed was justice denied. The day finally arrived when Absalom decided it was time to carry out his plan for revenge. He meticulously arranged a grand feast, a traditional celebration that was often used to bring family together in a display of unity and festivity. Absalom invited all his brothers, including Amnon, under the guise of reconciliation and goodwill. On the surface, it appeared to be a gesture aimed at fostering familial bonds. Yet beneath this facade, Absalom's intentions were anything but peaceful. As the feast progressed, Absalom watched carefully, waiting for the perfect moment when Amnon, lulled by the atmosphere of celebration, would be most vulnerable. When Amnon was relaxed, with his guard completely down, Absalom gave the predetermined signal to his servants. These servants, loyal to Absalom and well-prepared, knew precisely what was expected of them. They rose swiftly, and in the midst of what should have been a joyous occasion, they struck Amnon down, ending his life in a brutal act of vengeance. Absalom had orchestrated every detail, ensuring that his brother paid for what he had done to Tamar. The act was not just one of revenge, but a calculated statement. Absalom was willing to take justice into his own hands, even if it meant shedding his own brother's blood. The sudden violence shattered any illusion of peace within David's household, leaving those present in shock and chaos. The feast, which had begun as a show of unity, ended in bloodshed and betrayal, marking the beginning of an even deeper rift within the family. When David received word of Amnon's death, his reaction was one of overwhelming grief and anguish. The scriptures tell us that David tore his garments, a sign of deep mourning, and wept bitterly for his son. He was devastated, not only by the loss of Amnon, but also by the realization of how his own failures had contributed to this tragedy. In his lament, David cried out in agony, shouting, "O my son, Amnon, my son!" Recognizing the part he played in this unfolding chaos, his heart was broken, knowing that his negligence had set the stage for such violence among his children. David's grief was compounded by the knowledge that Absalom, his beloved son, was now a fugitive, having fled to Geshur to escape the consequences of his actions. The once proud and united family was now fractured, with David left to bear the weight of the consequences that his silence had wrought. Absalom's choice wasn't just about revenge, it was a statement against his father's failure to act, a public declaration of David's neglect. After Amnon's death, Absalom fled to Geshur, a region ruled by his maternal grandfather, Talmai, king of Geshur, fully aware of the weight of his actions and the repercussions that would follow. This act of vengeance shattered the fragile peace that had tenuously held David's household together, and the shockwaves were felt by all. Absalom's decision was swift and decisive. And while it provided a sense of justice for Tamar, it also left an indelible scar on the family. The cycle of violence was now spiraling further out of control, with David forced to face the dire consequences of his ongoing neglect. For Absalom, these 2 long years of simmering resentment had culminated in a brutal act that forever altered the dynamics of David's household, marking the point of no return. For David, the repercussions of Absalom's act were heartbreaking. He lost another son, though not by illness or accident, but through the spiraling effects of his own passivity. This wasn't a story of distant enemies. It was brother against brother, son against father, a deeply personal tragedy. Absalom, driven by loyalty to his sister, was now both an avenger and a fugitive. David's palace, once a place of authority, became a landscape of bitterness and resentment. The cycle of vengeance had turned family members into adversaries. Absalom's act wasn't just a momentary reaction, it set the stage for further division within David's family. With Amnon gone and Absalom in exile, the family's unity lay shattered. This act of vengeance would only lead to more conflict, as Absalom's desire for justice became an open wound for David's household. What started as anger had now transformed into a thirst for power, and Absalom's story was far from over. Absalom's revenge was a pivotal moment, not only for him but for David's entire family. The consequences of his actions spread rapidly through the palace, transforming what had once been a tense silence into an open and escalating conflict. David, now confronted with the harsh reality of his negligence, could do nothing but watch as his family spiraled further into discord and division. The death of Amnon and the subsequent exile of Absalom marked a significant descent, signaling the fragmentation of what had once been a unified family. What began as a single act of violence had snowballed into a relentless cycle of vengeance, mistrust, and bitterness, with no clear end in sight. The family's dynamic grew increasingly strained. David's inability to reconcile his role as both king and father left his children without the guidance they desperately needed. Absalom, now distant and harboring deeper resentment, was no longer just a grieving brother. He was a figure ready to challenge his father's authority. The scriptures highlight how unchecked anger and unresolved grievances within a family can lead to division and chaos. In David's palace, a place meant to symbolize unity, distrust and rivalry had taken over, creating a toxic atmosphere. This environment of distrust and pain extended beyond Absalom and David. Other family members, who had once been steadfastly loyal to the throne and each other, found themselves forced to pick sides amidst the growing tension. Absalom's resentment, left unchecked, began to transform into something far more dangerous, a potential rebellion. His unresolved anger turned into ambition, a desire not only for vengeance but also for power. He became a symbol of defiance against his father's rule, gathering followers who felt alienated or disillusioned by David's leadership. The loyalty that had once held David's family together began to fracture, replaced by suspicion and shifting allegiances. David, all perhaps recognizing the danger too late, could only watch as the son he had failed to protect turned into his greatest adversary. What had begun as a single tragic act had now grown into a full-scale conflict that threatened to tear apart the kingdom itself. As Absalom gathered support, his rebellion against David became inevitable. This was no longer a simple family feud. It had transformed into a clash between father and son that threatened the stability of the entire kingdom. David's silence and negligence had led to a situation where his own son was ready to lead a revolt. The palace, once a place of refuge and authority, had become a battleground. The lessons of unchecked anger and silence echoed through every corner of David's life, showing how these choices impact not just the family, but the kingdom. In this broken family, the lines were drawn, and the consequences of past actions could no longer be ignored. The tragedy of David's family would soon reach its peak, as Absalom's rebellion would test both father and son, ultimately revealing the devastating cost of a silent, unresolved legacy. David's story teaches that leadership isn't only about ruling a kingdom, it's about nurturing those closest to you. For all his wisdom and success on the battlefield, David's failure within his own family became a powerful lesson. His negligence in the face of Tamar's suffering and his silence after Amnon's wrongdoing led to a fracture in his household that would spiral into greater conflicts. The scriptures remind us that leadership extends beyond formal authority. It begins at home, with our closest relationships. For David, neglecting these responsibilities had devastating results. In moments of crisis, leaders can't afford to stay silent, especially when injustice arises among those they're responsible for. David's hesitation left a gap where guidance and justice should have been, a void that Absalom filled with vengeance. This teaches us that, as leaders, taking action, especially within our families, is essential to prevent festering resentment and to uphold justice. David's silence, a silence that overlooked the pain of Tamar and the wrongdoing of Amnon, inadvertently set off a chain of events that couldn't be reversed. The cost of negligence is a burden many leaders today can relate to. David's story also highlights the importance of maintaining open communication. Tamar's tragedy reveals that a family's strength relies on a safe, open environment where members feel heard. When silence is chosen over addressing issues, family bonds weaken, leaving members isolated in their struggles. David's failure to communicate with his children left them without a guiding hand, and his silence after Tamar's suffering broke the trust essential to a unified family. For modern families, creating spaces for open, honest dialogue is critical to maintaining trust and resilience. Another lesson from David's family tragedy is the necessity of setting firm boundaries. Absalom's rebellion was fueled by unresolved anger and unchecked ambition, emotions that had been left to grow without intervention. In any leadership role, establishing boundaries and maintaining accountability is vital. David's failure to confront Amnon's actions led to a lack of accountability that fueled Absalom's desire for justice and, ultimately, his rebellion. Setting and enforcing standards within the family, as within any community, is essential to prevent a cycle of grievances and retaliations. David's legacy is a reminder that silence in the face of wrongdoing is an action in itself, one that often leads to unintended consequences. This cycle of pain, rooted in neglected responsibilities, can serve as a guide for us today to prioritize family and address issues before they escalate. As we move forward, David's story calls us to be vigilant leaders within our own circles, breaking the chains of silence and fostering an environment where justice and understanding prevail. If you enjoyed the content, don't forget to leave a like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel to keep following more biblical stories like this one. Your participation is very important to us, and we want to hear your opinions and suggestions. May God bless you.